In a near-future military where legacy protocol and quiet prejudice ground innovation, Maya Aftab, a brilliant test pilot and lead systems engineer, fights for the right to fly the Griffin HX-9, a next-generation combat craft she helped design. Denied by commanders who fear her unorthodox methods and resent her rapid rise, she is backed only by a few allies, her stoic mentor Captain Elias Hart, a pragmatic technician Leela, and a rival-turned-antagonist, Commander Rowan. When a demonstration meant to validate the AX-9 turns into political theater, the military's entrenched hierarchy refuses to let a woman take the stick. Then, in a turn moment of quiet authority, a general arrives, salutes Maya, and gives her the key to the sky. What follows is a taut, cinematic ascent. Through technical failure, improvisation, and raw courage, that becomes both proof of innovation and a reckoning for the institution. The story explores ambition, gender, and power, the cost of daring, and the strange redemption that comes when one person refuses to accept the limits others place upon them. Its tone is cinematic, intimate, and unsparingly human. The hangar smelled like old grease and rain. It smelled like burned copper and spent fuel, like sunlight trapped in a canyon of steel. When Maya Aftab walked into Bay 3, the Griffin AX-9 folded over her like an answering thought. A creature of folded wings and matte black panels, valves and cooling ribs exposed like ribs of some prehistoric bird. The aircraft was larger than most fighters, longer in its shaft, a marriage of VTOL lift fans and a swept wing that could tear through a transonic climb. The HX-9 had been months of her life, her nights mapped in simulation matrices, her mornings splayed out across a bench littered with tools. She could tell you which bolt hummed at 620 hertz. She could explain the harmonic dampening in the dorsal actuator until someone fell asleep. To her it was less a machine than a confession. Morning, Maya. Leela was there, knee-deep in a tangle of wiring, face oily in the low light. Leela always had a new sock of coffee grounds stashed in her pocket, as if the plant from which caffeine was wrung had become an instrument to be measured and calibrated. You ever get tired of looking at it? Maya asked. Leela laughed without amusement. You mean tired of wanting to hurl myself at it and see if it breaks in prettier ways? No. Maya ran her palm along the HX-9's fuselage, feeling the chilled skin under her fingers. Her reflection was a finger behind the glass. Her dark hair was pulled back into a knot, a few rebellious strands sticking to her temple with sweat. The lab coat she wore had a dozen tiny tears where it had snagged on workbench edges and elevator fixtures. To the outside world, she was a lead systems engineer. At the center of herself, she was a pilot who had once, as a kid, climbed the irrigation tower outside her village and convinced the evening wind to hold her for a moment. Captain Elias Hart liked to say that Maya's hands were a compass for machines. He didn't say it lightly. Hart had the countenance of a man carved by weather, gray at the temples, slow to smile, and with the inexorable courtesy of a person who knew how to bury loss. He had been their squadron's old guard, a man whose knuckles still bore scars from prop shafts and whose laugh could be a sanction or a benediction. He had taken Maya under his wing the way an old tree gives shelter, unforced and patient. Any word from Rowan? Maya asked, not really wanting the answer. Elias's jaw tightened. Nothing good. He's here to see the demonstrations tomorrow. He's turned it into a command review. Politics. He used the word like a bladed thing. Politics had teeth. Rowan, with his tailored uniform and posture of someone who read memoranda like scripture, had a set of beliefs that fit across the cracks of the hangar. That machines were tools for men who had authority, that protocols were shields against the messy unpredictability of human initiative. Rowan's face, with its clean lines and the precise set of spectacles, looked like a man who had been airbrushed. You can fly it, Maya? Leela said. You wrote the damn flight control code. Maya had written parts of it, yes, and patched it at 2 in the morning when the actuator matrix refused to resolve microbursts in the simulation. She had been in the simulator when the HX-9 first achieved synthetic hover. She had dreamed the flight paths and argued about damping coefficients with mathematical obstinacy. Not once had anyone said she couldn't fly for technical reasons. They said she couldn't fly for other reasons. There were forms to be signed and approvals to be granted. There were whispers, someone reminding someone else that a test pilot's career ended with a crash, that, non-standard, approaches increased liability. Leela had been blunt. It's not about your ability, Maya. It's about how much a lot of people need to keep things exactly where they are. Rowan's refusal arrived as if it had been a preordained thunderstorm. The morning after the final systems check, Maya found a stack of papers on the briefing table, an order reassigning all primary test flights to Commander Rowan and a list of authorized pilots that conveniently omitted her name. The ink seemed to smugly imply permanence. She tore the order in half in the latrine and balled it like a fist. Hart had watched without speaking. He had seen her loosing a breath the way a man might wind a string for a long song. "You going to let him do this?" she asked. "You can't force the system," Hart said. "But you can make it wobble." Maya slept badly that night, the way someone trains for a race with one foot already over the line. In the few hours she allowed herself, she dreamt not of the HX-9, but of the irrigation tower again, and of the way the wind had felt then cold and honest. She woke with that feeling anchored behind her sternum, like a small warm stone. The next day, the hangar had the kind of theatrical hush that precedes a public spectacle. Flags were arranged with military precision. Dozens of officials had been invited. Cameras, the command had invited the new technology correspondents as well. An odd mixture of PR and pressure were arranged along the hangar doors. Rowan strutted like a conductor about to conduct a symphony he'd written in carefully ordered notes. Maya stood to the side, hands jammed in the pockets of her lab coat. She watched Rowan inspect the HX-9 as if it were a foreign object that had somehow invaded his authority. He spoke to the technicians in clipped sentences. He passed a hand along the fuselage like one might pat a prize-winning hound. He smiled in an economy that had no room for tenderness. "You'll be keeping me posted," he said, finally, to Hart. "I'll fly the first sortie myself. No surprises." Hart's eyes told a story of resignation, and, threaded beneath it, a thin undertow of defiance. "Of course," he said. He looked at Maya for a split second, long enough that she felt it as a circuit, and then away. Rowan's plan was straightforward. The HX-9 would perform a hover test, execute a high-angle climb, and then transition into forward flight. The metrics would be recorded and reviewed. The press would have footage. The brass would have an elegant demonstration in their pockets. It was the kind of thing that created order. Maya could have walked away. She could have continued designing, continued in the laboratory until the heat of her anger cooled into a tolerable hum. She could let Rowan take the honors and the risk and accept the quiet compromise. But this had ceased to be just about her. When command forgot to include her, it had reminded a whole roster of young women who read the press releases that possibility was still a narrow gate. That kind of erasure was a cruelty she had once promised herself she would not concede. She strode across the hangar with the steadiness of someone whose hands had memorized the interior of a cockpit. Rowan turned as she approached, his face folding into a simper he believed was paternal. "Maya," he said, as if her name were a footnote. "You know the protocol. This is a command review. You are not authorized to. You wrote the glide vector compensation for transonic shear," she said. "You can't argue that I'm not qualified." He smiled thinly. "Qualifications are not simply coded. They are earned through rank and responsibility." And you earned your rank by being safe, she asked. Or by playing a safer game. There was a ripple through the gathered officials like a pebble tossed into a bowl. Photographers adjusted their cameras. Leela's fingers dug into the edge of the panel, knuckles white. Before Rowan could frame another platitude, the hangar doors opened. A hush came over the room like the stilling of wings. The officers at the periphery straightened. The general moved with a quiet that cut emblems and protocol like thread. General Marcus Hale did not enter with fanfare. He stepped as if the hangar were his own skin and he were moving inside it. He was a broad man, not tall but solidly built, with a head that had been teethed on some other century. When he removed his gloves, they made a sound like paper on wood. He did not look at Rowan as though he needed permission to speak. My off-tab. His voice was even, a thing that did not rush even when it could have. Yes, sir. Her answer was reflex. He regarded her as if he had a map of experience laid out in the lines of her face. There was a brief flash of comprehension, like sun on water. Hart, he said. You summoned me? Hart straightened. Sir. He nodded. We discussed a demonstration. The general's eyes slid toward Rowan and then back to Maya. He did not ask whose idea the HX-9 had been or who'd written what line of code. He seemed to be measuring time and possibility. Then, in a motion so precise it looked ceremonial, he faced Maya and raised his hand in salute. For a moment, only a moment, the hangar was a camera shutter. Everyone else's breath seemed to stop in the same place. Maya felt, in the center of her chest, the wind before a storm. The salute was not merely a gesture of respect. In that instant, it was also a recognition of competence, of risk honored rather than feared. It was as if, by aligning himself, the general had reconfigured the lines of authority that had jammed the elevator of her ambitions. Captain Hart, General Hale said, commission Maya Aftab as pilot for the HX-9 demonstration. The room murmured like a field stirring. Rowan's face went a color that had no ritual name. Sir, with respect, regulations. General Hale's voice was soft as a blade. We will have no more obfuscation over this. I want the capabilities validated. If Commander Rowan insists on flying, he may, but I will not risk the program on politics. Maya Aftab will pilot the demonstration. Rowan folded and unfolded into posture like a man attempting to be resilient fabric. He smiled and said, Of course, sir. We will proceed. Once the initial waves had passed and the cameras had angled their lenses, Hart pulled Maya aside. His thumbs worried at the seam of his sleeve. He had something to say that seemed more important than anything he could utter in the presence of brass and cameras. You're going to be shadowed, he said. Telemetry feeds will be logged. We'll have a remote-controlled auxiliary in the loop. I don't want any surprises. Neither do I, Maya said. And if anything goes wrong? Captain, she interrupted. I built redundancy into the actuator matrix. I accounted for microburst turbulence in the forward transition. I ran 1,000 sims, Elias. If anything goes wrong, I'll know why. He looked at her then, not as if scolding, but as one sailor might look at another before they left port. Promise me you'll come back. She could have lied. She had been told to be pragmatic, to think like an engineer and not like a girl in a fairy tale. She thought of the irrigation tower and the wind holding her weight, and something like a laugh wanted to climb her throat. I promise, she said. The HX-9 had been lavished with protocol and inspection until it shone. The sensors lit like a horizon. Anxious photographers drifted at the edges of the crowd, hungry for an image of a new age, where their footage might look like prophecy. Leela and the technicians lined the flight, deck like priests in waiting, eyes on the instruments. Maya strapped in slowly, letting each strap land over her shoulders like a returning tide. The cockpit smelled like vinyl and ozone. Rowan cleared his throat as she sealed the canopy. Maya, You understand that this is a controlled profile. No deviation without command approval. She smiled. No deviation without command approval, Commander. The verification lights blinked. Hart's voice came through the headset, low and steady. Systems nominal. Redundancy checks complete. You are green across the board. Maya felt the hum of the AX-9 beneath her. A loose, animal bass that matched the rhythm of her pulse. She referenced a list of steps in her mind like prayer gyros online, thrust calibration, hydraulics, flight control integrity. Hover engaged, and the ground seemed to fall away in that peculiar way that humans have learned to let machines do for them. The HX-9 rose like a coin from water, vibration shifting to a fine pitch. They recorded everything, of course. There would be numbers and charts, and 1,000 small notations. But flying, really flying, is a thing that slides into the skin more than the logbook. It is muscle memory and the way the world simplifies into lines and horizons. The forces on the craft are like hands on a person, felt and negotiated with patience. The hover was clean. The transition into the climb felt like a song they had practiced in the simulator 1,000 times. Maya fed the control inputs gently, and the AX-9 obeyed, a chorus of actuators and fans and software singing in concert. Then, as the craft reached the planned angle and their telemetry shivered into a perfect arc, the world decided to add an element of lusty chaos. A microburst hit. It was small, really, in the scale of storm shapes, the sort of pocketed turbulence that hides between atmospheric seams and will rip the precise order out of any flight plan, if it pleases. The HX-9 bucked like a horse caught unawares. Alarms threaded through Maya's headphones in perfect, mechanical shrieks. The flight control put up no illusions. An actuator in the dorsal plane reported a loss in pressure. One of the lift fans stuttered as a protective circuit tripped. Rowan's voice found her through the comms, taut with a triumph she could hear as smugness. Abort. Abort. Bring her down. There's a dampening protocol. Maya snapped, initiating compensatory vector now. She had designed the compensatory vector to be automatic at a certain threshold, but the protective circuits had opted for a shoot-off in one of the fans to avoid overheating the motor. It was an algorithm's small act of prudence, which, in the theater of flight, can be lethal. Maya's fingers moved. She rebalanced thrust, nudging the remaining fans into a higher duty cycle. She fed in a dampening spiral, bleeding off energy into the wing roots. The HX-9 was stubborn and elastic. The graphs that would later be printed and annotated would show the graceful arc of a plane learning to survive. For now it was a matter of feel and small decisions: throttle, trim, yaw. Her hands moved with the surety of someone who had not let the machine be her master, but had made a contract with it. Elias, now. She was aware of her voice as if it were a separate instrument. Hart's hands were quick and sure, back at the auxiliary console. Leela's face on the ground was a pale coin, her jaw clenched. Remote compensator engaged. Elias said, "Why have backup vector?" But the AX-9 was not content to be stabilized. A filament of flame licked along the edge of the aft exhaust. A symptom, not a catastrophe, but one that required immediate attention. The photographers were filming, breathless, their lenses now fixed on a moment that had taken on the staining tang of danger. Maya felt the craft's skin heat under her seat. Her palms were sweating. She thought of the irrigation tower and of wind as a companion rather than a hazard. She thought of her childhood, of being told to tilt her head and see the world differently. She felt suddenly, with almost a physical ache, the weight of the people who had been taught to stay inside prescribed boundaries. Eject. Someone asked. Not yet. Maya's voice was a low thing. Ejecting was not an option. Not for her. Not for the AX-9. They had designed redundancy into the structure for survivability. Ejecting would be giving the craft up to the sky. She patched into the diagnostic routine and spoke to the machine as if to a friend. Bypass circuit 7. Engage manual valve. Increase pitch to 20 degrees and dump lateral vector slowly. The machine answered in numbers and the soft shudder of a beast in labor. The alarms continued to sing, but softer now. The flame slithered, and then died, swallowed by the exhaust as the motor stabilized. A collective breath released in the hangar like a cord, letting go. Rowan's face had slackened into something that had the look of having been taught an unuseful lesson. The cameras kept rolling. The journalists had found their story in peril resolved. General Hale said nothing for a long while. He had watched with the kind of attention that does not waste itself on spectacle. When Maya eased the HX-9 down and the skids kissed concrete with a soft, respectful judder, the hangar erupted. Applause and shouts, and the rustle of recorded audio filled the air like birds. Leela sobbed into her hands. Hart's jaw worked, but he did not clap. He stood like a man who had been on the bridge and watched a ship find land. Rowan forced a smile, a badly drawn thing. That was impressive. That was survival, Maya said, climbing from the cockpit with a small, fierce laugh. Her hair was stuck to her forehead, and her palms left dark prints on the rim of the canopy. Up close, she could hear the HX-9 cooling, the little sigh of metal as its systems rebalanced. General Hale met her near the aircraft. He did not offer his hand in a ceremonial way. Instead, he looked at her as if he had been waiting for a certain truth. "You did very well," he said. "You could have let him fly," Maya said, the words cutting through the noise. Hale's mouth twitched. "Would you have sued me if I did? Would you have had me explain why a man rather than an engineer piloted the first demo?" She shrugged. "You could have done what you wanted. You chose differently." "Because I knew who could handle this craft." He let out something like a smile. "And because sometimes there are reasons to shake the trees. People expect that a man in a uniform will protect tradition. But tradition is not always a protection. It can be a cage. I have watched enough programs die on deference." There was a pause like the one between storm and sun. Maya felt something settle under her ribs, an odd mix of vindication and emptiness. She had flown, she had proven. Yet proof is a brittle currency. Rowan would find ways to rewrite the record. People would file reports and write memos, and, in some cases, the word would not travel where it needed to. "You changed things," Leela said later, when they allowed themselves a late night in the small diner off base. "You changed a lot." Maya drank her coffee until it went cold. The HX-9 skin still sang in the hollow of her ear. "Did I?" she asked. Leela rolled her eyes. "Yeah. You got the general to salute you in public. That's not nothing." They laughed in the way two people do when the latter is a defense against the flood of meaning. But the change was not instant. The base newspaper wrote an article that praised the craft's design and only mentioned the pilot in passing. Rowan continued to write memos with an eloquence that could make bureaucracy look like poetry. The HX-9 went to more trials. The engineers had more work to do. Maya had more nights where sleep became a thin, reluctant thing. Weeks later, an incident arrived like a slow, inconvenient tide. An unauthorized drone force pressed into civilian airspace along a narrow mountain pass used by supply convoys. The convoys were moving food and medicine to towns that had been under siege by something that was not fully named. The ministry wanted a discreet solution that limited collateral and kept political fallout contained. The AX-9 could do the job. Its sensors could discriminate. Its transition to hover could allow surgical intercepts. But the mission profile would be close and risky. Rowan argued for more reconnaissance and for deploying traditional interceptors. The ministry, stunned by the earlier demonstration and the PR risks of an escalation, wanted a demonstrative but precise action. Hale turned to Maya. "You're not asking me to fly into a war," she said. "No," he said. "I'm asking you to lead a small sortie, to intercept and disable the drones. We need someone who knows the systems from the inside. They were moments where the sky tests the mettle of people and institutions. Leading the sortie would be to move beyond validation into the sphere of consequence. It would be to prove that the HX-9 existed not as a press release, but as a living instrument in a messy world. Maya thought of the towns, of the people waiting for food shipments, of the faces in the crowd who would be disappointed if the convoys were stopped. She thought of Hart and Leela, and the way Hart had once promised to keep his men alive if he could. She thought of the irrigation tower and the wind, and how small it had seemed when she had been young. Then she thought of the alternative, a program that had been designed to protect, and then let itself gather dust under the palms of caution. The decision arrived with clarity. "I will lead the sortie," she said. The sortie was surgical. The X-9s, two of them, slipped into the mountain pass like birds skimming a knife edge. Their radar signatures were flattened. The drones were numerous and designed for persistent surveillance, not for evasion. They were also adaptable and aggressive. They fired countermeasures as the HX-9 bore down. Rowan's voice came brittle now, through the net. "Maintain standoff. Don't engage." Maya's jaw tightened. "We're not going to escalate. We're going to disable." The first pass was a textbook execution. Maya used a combination of electromagnetic pulses from the HX-9's wing pods and precise kinetic intercepts to sever the drone's control surfaces. One of the HX-9s sustained minor damage to a lift fan, debris, and had to limp back. Communications glitched and returned. The drones reconfigured, some swarming in ragged formations like wasps with too much venom. At one point, a drone angled toward a civilian convoy, its targeting systems locked as if to take a shot. The convoy truck, its canvas flapping in the mountain wind, had no armor to defend it. Maya's mind measured the clock. She threaded between the drone and the convoy in a move that could have been arrogance if it failed. She dove and used the AX-9's aft wake to throw the drone off. The drone tumbled and then fell, rocket motors screaming and collapsing into a wrecked pirouette. The sortie ended not with triumph, but with a collection of small, hard-won successes. The convoys passed. The towns received their supplies. There were no casualties. Back on the base, there were reporters who tried to turn the narrative into a monument to daring. There were analysts who cataloged the sortie's efficiency in spreadsheets. There were also quiet moments. Hart sitting with Maya in the standard issue kitchen, the clink of utensils, where the meaning of what had happened could only be measured in the steadiness of someone else's breath. "You were reckless?" Rowan muttered one night, not so much a rebuke as an expression of wounded pride. "You called it prudent," Maya said. "You're only angry because your prudence would have cost people food." Rowan had no friendly retort. He had resources that could have stymied the program. He had made a career of being the right kind of conservative in a world that rewarded careful conservatism. He had miscalculated what it meant to have one person break the mold and do it without being performative about it. The aftershocks of the sortie changed things slowly. Young women in the base's maintenance crews began to ask questions in meetings. A technician that had once been invisible in the background was called up to brief a group of officials. Hart was promoted, though not without cost. Maya was offered a position leading a small innovation squadron. She accepted, not out of triumph, but with the wary acceptance of someone who has seen how the world makes room by cutting and grafting at the margins. The HX-9 went on to be adopted in limited numbers, not as a revolution but as a working tool. It did not solve every problem. It did, however, change the baseline of what the squadron believed was possible. Men and women who had been asleep in the same bed of assumptions found that the bed was smaller and the room larger. The final scene of the story is not a curtain call in a hangar with brass and flags. It is a quiet flight at dusk. Maya climbed into an HX-9 of her own design, older now by a few years and patient with a world that had scarred into a tougher shape. Leela was there, of course, and Hart had found a way to annoy his superiors into giving him more time with the pilots he had trained. They took off into a sky that was purple and bruised at the edges. "Do you ever think?" Leela asked, voice small in the cramped canopy, "that the general knew what he was doing when he saluted you?" Maya watched the horizon, watching the way the light slid along the mountains like a ribbon. "He knew something," she said. "Maybe he just did the math and found that talent outweighed tradition. Maybe he wanted to see which way the wind would move a small thing." They flew in companionable silence for a while, the kind that lyrics settle into. The HX-9 moved like a practiced animal through the dusk, turning the sky into a space of possibility that felt not unlike the field behind her childhood home. Maya thought of gravity and its stubborn, beautiful insistence on pull. She thought of lift and the negotiations it requires. She thought about promises, the ones people make to themselves and the ones made in salutes. When they landed, the hangar lights gave the machines the flat sheen of reassurance. A young technician brushed his hands off and walked up to Maya with a question and a chart and the bright, needy hope of someone who had not yet been taught to measure their wings. "Could I?" he began. Maya found herself smiling because she knew, with that steady surety that comes from living through a storm, exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said. "Come back tomorrow with a new schematic." He grinned as if the future had been given to him in a single, incandescent moment. Maya breathed in the smell of the hangar and the machines and the rainy evening. There had been battles she had not chosen and versions of success she had not wanted. She had been tested and found, in a sense, public property, proof of possibility. Yet the most honest thing she could admit was that the flight itself had changed her in quieter ways. It had taught her about the economy of courage, about how sometimes you had to be the person who took a chance so that other people did not have to. As they began to pack away tools and blankets, General Hale appeared in the doorway. He had aged like a man who did not regret his decisions. He returned her salute, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And for a moment they stood like two people who had understood the same thing in different ways. "You kept your promise," he said. "So did you," she answered. He nodded. "Sometimes a salute isn't about power. It's about recognition. And recognition, it turns out, can be a kind of revolution." She laughed then, a clean sound carried by the metal of the hangar. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere in it a small bird started a song that sounded like a clear, particular thing. Maya felt the lift of the sky tugging at the edges of her being, and she knew the truth of it. Flight would always be about risk and trust, and the stubborn possibility that someone, somewhere, would insist on doing what must be done, even when the rope that tied them to the ground whispered safety like a lie. In the end, a general's salute was not the closing of a story, but the opening of an instruction to recognize those who know how to fly and to give them the space to soar. Maya understood then that her victory was not a singular triumph, but a turning point, small and stubborn and necessary. It was the difference between a gate and a doorway, and she had just had the humility to push it open.